to other cities is, experience the city through bus or transit or whatever option they have outside of a private vehicle. And so some recent experiences include traveling from Windsor to Toronto via Rail Canada, which was an excellent experience. And then also getting to Toronto and then not having to drive a car at all, walking or using the subway system, etc. And then also noting that this trend of seeing the rail car or the streetcar come back, and a lot of cities are going back to the streetcar system. And so I think that there are a number of opportunities that we have here in the city of Detroit to address these challenges. And the other thing that I did today was look up. I was a part of the AIA Transportation Symposium last month, and they talked about, walkability scores and all those types of things. So I'm like, I'm just curious. Let me just go on the website and look up the walkability score. So you can use your home, your work, your whatever. And so I just chose to use my address, which is in Midtown, which is close to here. And of 100, the Midtown area ranked about 77, which is like the 5th highest for the city of Detroit. And so the Detroit average is about 54. And so, of course, that's no surprise for people who, walk a lot in the city. But one of the things that just made me realize is that although my neighborhood is one of those neighborhoods that's highly walkable, I don't really walk a lot. And so, I think that there's a lot of just, a cultural change sometimes that we just have to make that kind of shift. And so I think that even has to happen in the planning process, because we've been so used to planning for the automobile and maybe some other different modes, but now how do we think about the reality that more and more people want to experience the city on a bike, they want to experience the city on foot and other modes. And so the challenge for us is really how do we do that in a meaningful way, but I think also making sure that it's accessible, it's reliable, and it's equitable is certainly something that we're looking to achieve through our planning in the city.
Thank you very much, Marja. Before we move on, just one quick question I do have for you. When we think about Woodward Light Rail, which there's obviously a lot of excitement about right now, one of the phrases that we often hear come up is transit-oriented development, and we often hear statistics thrown out about how when other communities implemented a light rail system, for every dollar, I don't know the exact number, but I think it's like for every dollar of investment in the light rail, like $8 of economic development materialized. What is the Planning and Development Department doing to kind of plan for that and facilitate it as Woodward Light Rail moves forward?
There is a TLD work group that's working on sort of what that looks like for the Woodward corridor. It is being led by Norm White, who's sort of the champion for the Woodward Light Rail project. And there are several planners on our staff that are participating. I'm not directly participating, but again, looking at how we might need to change some policies. Is there a specific overlay that we need to add to the zoning ordinance to accommodate that? But again, how do we plan ahead and make sure that we're setting up a place where we can experience the sort of spin-off or economic development opportunities that can really come from the Woodward Light Rail? So even as we're exploring, where stations might be, we're also trying to make considerations for where you might increase density, what might need to be zoned for mixed use, where we might want to have residential. And it's interesting conversation, because there's some retailers, of course, you think, okay, they want to be here, then they say, we don't want to be right in front of the stop because nobody wants to have lines right outside of their store. So there are a lot of things that we have to deal with, but there is a group that's solely focused on making sure that there is a TOD plan component that goes along with the Woodward Light Rail.
Okay, and one other quick question too. Todd brought up during his opening presentation, complete streets, and there's clearly a growing grassroots movement in the city of Detroit pushing for the adoption of a complete streets ordinance. Is the mayor on board with that? What is Mayor Bing's position relative to complete streets?
I would think based on the vision that he's already laid out, and I haven't had a specific conversation with him about complete streets, but there are several city departments that are working on the Complete Streets Coalition, and I think that the push for having some legislation, ordinance, or whatever, I think the mayor does support that.
Okay. All right, we're going to move on to our next panelist. He is Dr. Robin Boyle, who, interestingly enough, in a former life when I worked here at Wayne State University in the Center for Urban Studies, was actually one of my bosses. So, Dr. Boyle, the floor is yours.
He always reminds me of that. Well, thank you for coming out, and coming out on a night like tonight. A night like tonight reminds me of where I come from. This was normal. Having rain like this was part of my life. But the reason I want to mention that is that I was 12 before there was any car around my household. And therefore, for 12 years in my life, moving around was done by a range of different transportation modes. If you went to go and learn how to swim, it was a walk, a bus, a subway, a walk, and then you got into the swimming pool, if you were lucky. And then when I went to high school and then went on to college, I used suburban train systems. And I personally didn't have any automotive system until I was 24. And even then, that was an alternative to it. My point is, where you come from and the culture of moving is terribly, terribly important. So I think the process of change that we're hearing tonight and seeing that interactive map emerge is, I think, part of a shift. While I think the engineering story and the policy wonks telling us all this good stuff and reports out of Brookings that tell us how important alternative transportation modes are, it really does come down to the way in which we live our lives and the way in which we connect with one another and connect to different transportation systems. So I have a whole bunch of notes here that I actually don't think I need to use because I think you get it. But what I would like to say is that the way in which we get the message beyond Marja's work in the city, or beyond the work of the city council or others, is actually to engage in a broader conversation. And that ability to communicate about alternative transportation choices is vital. If I was to ask anyone in the audience here, who was the most significant person to write about cities in the last 60 years, I can almost guarantee that everybody that's sitting around this room tonight would say none other than Jane Jacobs. It's obvious, it just comes. It comes naturally out of me. And I would sort of add a second person who is actually polar opposite, but terribly important. And I've forgotten his name, it's out of my head. It'll come back to me in a minute. My point is that she wasn't an engineer. She wasn't a planner. She wasn't somebody who was engaged in the policy system. In fact, she was against much of the policy system at the time. And therefore, the way in which she communicated about New York and about density and about the importance of cities was that she engaged in a broader discussion that impacted the way we think about places generally. So I tried to think, well, what example could I bring tonight that relates to that? And I thought about bicycle diaries. I know this is a somewhat biased audience, but many people have got this in the library. 1, 2, 3, 4. Not bad. Okay. Maybe I can get a few sales for David Byrne. I reference David Byrne for 2 reasons. One, believe it or not only is he the leader of Talking Heads and a sort of pop icon, most importantly, he was born in suburban Glasgow, where I come from. So he relates to the weather that I'm talking about as well. But the point of this book is that he's not written as a planner, an architect, an engineer. He writes about it as a human being who decides to take a bicycle with him when he travels, and he tells us stories about New York. He tells us stories about Buenos Aires and Berlin. He also tells us a little story about Detroit that is not particularly complimentary to our hometown, but never mind. The point I'm trying to make is that he brings alternative transportation systems, the chance of cycling, taking a bus, taking the subway, as a way of life, as a way of changing from a single mode to a much more nuanced combination of choices. And I end with a point that I use in my class all the time. Planning is really about choices, and we need to give people choices and not only push them down one particular track. In this case, as we know, it is auto-dependency. So that would be my point for tonight's conversation. It's about choice, and it's about the way in which we communicate this to everybody.
Thank you very much, Dr. Boyle. Before we move on, just a couple of quick questions for you. I know that you for years have been advocating that the city of Detroit and the surrounding communities, county governments, that we all need to work together collectively to try to foster greater connectivity and increase urban density. What kind of grade would you give us in terms of how we're doing on that? Does somebody not pay the bill? Or?